What if one impulsive decision could destroy a career? A single action, one moment of disrespect, and an officer crosses a line that can never be erased. When a black FBI agent becomes the target of a fellow officer's gun, it's not just a breach of protocol, it's a deeper reflection of systemic issues. The tension in the air is thick. Before we continue, let us know, where are you watching from? How would you react if you were in this officer's shoes? This moment will change everything. Agent Claire Williams had been in the FBI for years. She was sharp, determined, and had proven herself time and time again in a career that often felt like an uphill battle. Being a black woman in law enforcement wasn't easy, and she'd faced her share of challenges. But it was more than just the tough cases. It was the everyday struggle of navigating a system that wasn't built for people like her. That emotional toll had left scars, but she had always pushed forward. However, today was different. Today, she wasn't just fighting the system. She was fighting someone in it. On the other side was Officer Megan Shaw, newer to the force and still trying to find her footing. She was younger, brash, and had a reputation for being overly confident. At first glance, Shaw appeared to be the kind of officer who would follow protocol, but there was something lurking beneath the surface, something dangerous. It wasn't just her inexperience. It was the deep, unspoken bias that colored her every decision. That bias would prove to be her downfall. The setting was supposed to be routine. It was a quiet neighborhood, nothing out of the ordinary. A stop that had been made hundreds of times before. But as the evening wore on, something began to shift. A sense of unease filled the air, and the tension between the two officers grew stronger with every passing moment. Neither realized yet that this day would change everything. The moment the tension snapped, it was almost impossible to process. What had started as just another routine operation was now a ticking time bomb. Officer Shaw, for reasons no one could explain, suddenly gripped her gun. Without warning, she aimed it directly at Agent Claire Williams. Her hand was steady, but her eyes were full of something darker. There was no hesitation, no warning, just a cold, calculated move that sent a shockwave through the scene. Shaw's voice came out sharp, almost daring Williams to make a move. "You're not in charge here," Shaw said, her words cutting through the air. Agent Williams froze for a split second, processing what had just happened. A fellow officer had just pointed a gun at her. This wasn't just some misunderstanding or a high-stress moment. This was something worse, much worse. It was a complete breach of protocol, something no one could ever prepare for. Shaw had crossed a line, and in that moment, everything changed. Williams stood tall, refusing to let the fear rise. Her body was tense, but she wasn't going to let Shaw see the impact this had on her. Every part of her being screamed for action. But Williams remained calm. Her thoughts raced as the reality of the situation sank in. One wrong move, and this could end in disaster for both of them. The worst part. It wasn't just about the threat in front of her. It was about everything this moment represented. The racial tensions in law enforcement, the unspoken biases that often went unchecked. It was all coming to a head in a way that no one had expected. And now, this was her fight to win. "Shaw, put the weapon down," Williams said, trying to keep her voice steady, but the words felt too calm, too controlled for what was happening. Shaw didn't respond. The gun stayed pointed at Williams, and the weight of the situation only grew heavier with each passing second. Williams could feel it in the air, the fear, the anger, the tension. everyone around them was waiting for someone to make a move, to do something that would stop this madness before it was too late. A few officers nearby stood frozen, unsure of what to do. They had all seen their fair share of tense moments, but nothing like this. Phones began to come out, the quiet clicks of cameras capturing the scene. The moment felt surreal. It was as if the world had come to a halt. The street was eerily still, save for the sound of the cameras starting to record. Those recordings would soon make their way to every corner of the internet, turning this incident into something much bigger than just two officers facing off. It was a spectacle now, a moment where everything, every flaw, every mistake, every system that failed, was on display. The racial divide within law enforcement had been simmering for years, and this was the spark that could ignite the flames. The questions started. Was this a personal conflict? Or was it about something deeper? Were Shaw's actions rooted in something more than just fear or stress? Was there a bias that had been allowed to grow unchecked? As Williams held her ground, her thoughts couldn't help but race. Every second felt like it could be her last. She had to think fast, but every decision felt like it had the weight of 1,000 others behind it. Shaw's hand trembled slightly, a flicker of uncertainty that only made the moment even more intense. Williams wondered, would Shaw really pull the trigger? Would this officer, who was supposed to be her colleague, her partner, really go this far? Williams had to act, but there was no easy way out. Would someone intervene? Could another officer step in before things went too far? The tension in the air was suffocating. It was as if time was stretching, each second feeling like a lifetime. What would happen if no one took control? What if Shaw refused to back down? It was impossible to predict, and that uncertainty made everything even worse. Would they resolve this, or would it escalate beyond repair? The situation was spiraling, and no one knew if they were witnessing the calm before a storm or the start of an inevitable disaster. The room was charged with nervous energy, the kind that happens when you know things are about to change forever. And then, just when it seemed like no one was going to act, a voice cut through the chaos. "Officer Shaw, step away from your weapon," the commanding officer's voice rang out, clear and firm. The words were a command, not a suggestion. The room froze as if every person present was holding their breath. It was a moment of truth, and in that instant, Shaw's career unraveled. The weight of the situation hit her all at once. She had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. The consequences of Shaw's actions were inevitable. There was no escaping them. The fallout from this moment would not just be career-ending for Shaw. It would reverberate across the department and maybe even beyond. The focus was no longer just on the gun or the officers in the standoff. It was about everything this represented. The truth, once again, was unavoidable, and now the world would be watching. Officer Megan Shaw had no idea what had hit her. The moment she lowered her weapon, the reality of her actions started to crash down on her. The commanding officer's voice was like a punch to the gut, and the words came through with the force of thunder. "What in God's name were you thinking, Officer Shaw?" It was a question no one could answer. Shaw stood motionless, her face flushed with embarrassment and fear. The weight of her mistake was sinking in with every second. She had just jeopardized everything she'd worked for in an instant. The room was silent, everyone waiting for some sort of explanation, but Shaw had none. Agent Claire Williams, who had been standing in the eye of the storm just moments ago, now found herself taking on a different role. Despite the chaos, she remained calm and composed. It wasn't just the gun that had caused the rift. It was the moment Shaw had crossed a line that no one could ignore. Williams was more than just the victim in this situation. She was a symbol of everything that needed to change. With all eyes on her, she stood tall, unwilling to let Shaw's reckless actions go unchallenged. "I've worked my whole life to earn my place here," Williams said, her voice firm, every word measured. "What you've done is more than just reckless. It's dangerous, and it reflects a system we've all been trying to fix." Her words were not just aimed at Shaw. They were a call to the entire department, a call to see that the issues of race, bias, and disrespect had gone unchecked for far too long. In that moment, Williams wasn't just holding Shaw accountable. She was standing up against everything the system had allowed to fester. But, as the reality of Shaw's actions began to set in, it wasn't just Williams who had to reckon with what happened. The public was watching. As the news broke, it didn't take long for the incident to explode into something far bigger than just an isolated act of insubordination. News outlets picked up the story, each report more detailed than the last. Social media erupted in anger, calling for accountability. Hashtags flooded the platforms, demanding justice, not just for Williams, but for the entire system that had allowed this behavior to continue unchecked for so long. People from all walks of life took to their phones and their screens to voice their opinions. Some sided with Williams, praising her for staying calm under pressure, while others called for Shaw's immediate removal from the force. But the general consensus was clear. This wasn't just an issue of one bad officer. It was a symptom of a much larger problem within law enforcement. And that problem had to be addressed, or nothing would change. Back in the interrogation room, Shaw sat in silence, the weight of everything crashing down on her. Her face was pale, her hands clenched in her lap, and her thoughts were racing. The room felt suffocating, the silence oppressive. She hadn't expected it to go this far. All she had done was act on impulse, right? But now, as the enormity of her actions sank in, she realized it wasn't that simple. What she had done wasn't just about the gun. It wasn't just about a mistake in the heat of the moment. It was about everything that had led to that moment. Shaw had always been a little unsure of herself in this job, but she had never imagined things would go this wrong. She thought of the way she'd been raised, the people who had shaped her views, the biases that she never questioned because they had always been a part of her world. She had never considered how deep those biases ran, or how they might influence her decisions as an officer. Now, sitting in that room, it was all painfully clear. Was it fear? Or something darker? Something about Williams, something about her presence, had triggered something Shaw couldn't fully understand. Her personal prejudices had guided her actions, and she couldn't deny it anymore. The worst part, it had cost her everything. Shaw had lost her career in an instant, but the personal cost was much deeper. She had failed not just as a police officer, but as a human being who had allowed hate and bias to dictate her actions. The incident left Shaw with a harsh reality to face. No amount of apology could undo what she had done. Her career was over. There was no coming back from pointing a gun at a fellow officer, especially when that officer had done nothing but try to help. But the real question was, would she ever be able to live with herself? Could she come to terms with the fact that she had been a part of something that hurt so many people, including herself? For Agent Williams, this was a pivotal moment. But it wasn't just about her. The incident had brought the deep-rooted issues of law enforcement to the forefront. While Shaw's actions would cost her everything, the world was now watching, and people wanted change. Williams knew this was just the beginning of a much larger fight, one that would take time and effort to win. But she was ready for it. This wasn't just about one officer. It was about changing the system so that future officers wouldn't face the same hurdles and discrimination that Williams had to deal with every day. It was about creating a future where officers could work together without fear, where respect wasn't something that had to be earned, but something that was automatically given, no matter the color of your skin. This moment could be the start of something better, but only if the right steps were taken. What Shaw didn't realize in the heat of that moment was that her actions didn't just expose her own flaws. They revealed a much deeper issue, one that was embedded within the very system she worked for. She hadn't just pointed a gun at a fellow officer. She had brought to light the systemic problems that had been simmering under the surface for years. Shaw's outburst was like pulling a thread in a worn-out fabric. What followed wasn't just about her breakdown, but about the cracks in the whole system that law enforcement had long ignored. Shaw's actions weren't an isolated incident. They weren't just the result of one officer's poor decision. It was a reflection of a culture that had allowed racial bias to creep into the system. The police force, meant to protect and serve, had become a place where certain officers, like Shaw, were allowed to harbor their own prejudices, unchecked and unchallenged. It wasn't just Shaw's problem. It was a problem that ran deep through the entire system. From lack of proper training to policies that didn't address the real issues of bias, the flaws were far too visible to ignore. And now, Shaw's moment of rage had exposed them for all to see. For Agent Claire Williams, it wasn't just about what happened between her and Shaw. This was bigger. Williams wasn't just trying to survive the day or get past this incident. She knew that her struggle represented something much more significant. As a black officer in a predominantly white system, she had faced her own battles, quiet ones that most people didn't even see. But this was different. This wasn't just about a gun being pointed at her. It was about everything that had led to that moment. Williams didn't want to just move on from this. She didn't just want her career to continue or for the issue to be swept under the rug. What happened with Shaw sparked something much more powerful, something that could push the boundaries of law enforcement and bring real change. The incident became a turning point. Williams became a voice for more than just herself. She became the voice for all the people who had been overlooked, dismissed, or worse, targeted because of their race. As news outlets picked up the story, Williams found herself at the center of a national conversation about racism in policing. The shock of Shaw's actions had reached far beyond their department, sparking debates about how law enforcement treated minorities. The conversation had begun, and it was one that couldn't be ignored anymore. The system had to change, and Williams, despite the personal trauma of the incident, knew she had to be part of that change. It was clear that the issue went beyond one officer or one department. It was a nationwide problem. Social media exploded with calls for accountability, not just for Shaw's actions, but for the broader, systemic issues that allowed this type of behavior to persist. Hashtags demanding justice for victims of police violence and racial bias began trending. And in the center of all this was Agent Williams. She became a symbol of the fight against the flawed system, standing up not only for herself, but for everyone who had been affected by the inequality that was so deeply entrenched in law enforcement. Williams became one of the most vocal advocates for reform, using her platform to push for better training, better policies, and a complete overhaul of the way law enforcement approached race. She didn't want to be the face of a protest, but she understood that sometimes, when you're given a platform, you have to use it. Her story became one of resilience and strength, a testament to the many officers and civilians who had quietly been fighting against the system, even when no one was looking. But the change wasn't easy. While some rallied behind her, there were others who resisted the very idea of reform. The idea that the system was broken was hard for some to accept, especially for those who had benefited from it for so long. But Williams wasn't backing down. She knew the road ahead would be tough, and that change wouldn't happen overnight. But the conversation had started, and it wasn't going away. The incident with Shaw was the catalyst, but it was only the beginning of a much larger movement. It wasn't just about the bad apples in law enforcement, it was about the whole tree. It was about understanding the deep-rooted issues of racism and inequality within the system and working together to address them. As Williams continued to speak out, more and more people joined the conversation. The voices of those who had been silenced for so long began to rise. Officers who had kept quiet for fear of retaliation found the courage to speak out against the systemic racism they had witnessed in their own departments. The truth was becoming impossible to ignore, and Williams, through her courage, had sparked a movement that was bigger than anyone could have predicted. For Shaw, the realization came too late. Her actions had cost her everything: her job, her reputation, and her place in a system she had once been proud to be a part of. But the price she paid wasn't just personal. It was a reflection of how the system had failed her, and how it had failed everyone. The biases that Shaw had held were not hers alone. They were a product of a broken system that had allowed those biases to fester for far too long. Williams knew that the road to true change would be difficult, but she also knew that the more people who stepped up and fought for justice, the harder it would be for anyone to ignore the problems that had plagued law enforcement for years. Shaw's actions had forced the conversation into the open, and now there was no turning back. Agent Claire Williams had always known that change wouldn't come easily, but she hadn't expected the tipping point to arrive in the way it did. When she had first walked into that operation with Officer Shaw, she never imagined it would end with a gun being pointed at her. But what started as a personal crisis soon turned into something much larger. Shaw's actions had sparked a much-needed conversation about the problems within law enforcement. For Williams, it wasn't just about surviving the moment. It was about using her voice to challenge a system that had let her, and so many others, down. As the dust settled and the world began to process what had happened, Williams found herself at the forefront of a movement. She wasn't just the victim in this story. She was now the face of change. The incident had brought to light not just Shaw's failure, but the systemic issues that had been ignored for far too long. Williams had become the leader of a cause she never intended to fight for. She had always focused on her job, on doing things the right way, but now she had to stand for something bigger than herself. Her journey was a testament to resilience. Despite the personal toll the incident took on her, Williams knew she couldn't let it be the end of the conversation. She had been silenced too many times, forced to fit into a mold that didn't acknowledge her struggles. But this time, she wasn't going to be quiet. Williams became one of the loudest voices calling for accountability, not just for Shaw, but for the entire law enforcement community. She stood up and said, "This has to change." Her courage made her a beacon for all those who had felt overlooked, undervalued, or dismissed. This was more than just about one officer's misconduct. It was about a culture that had allowed bias and inequality to thrive unchecked for far too long. As for Officer Shaw, her fate was sealed. In the blink of an eye, her career had unraveled. One decision, pointing a gun at a fellow officer, had cost her everything. There was no coming back from that. Shaw's actions weren't just a failure as an officer. They exposed the deeper, uglier truths about her own biases. For her, there was no escaping the weight of what she had done. Her career ended that day. The loss of her badge wasn't just about her misconduct. It was about the fact that her prejudices had influenced her actions, something she could no longer ignore. Shaw was forced to face herself in a way she never had before. But Shaw's journey wasn't over. No, the road ahead for her was filled with a different kind of challenge, the kind of challenge that came from confronting her own demons. Could she truly reflect on what she had done and what it said about her? Could she take responsibility for her actions and begin the long road to change? Redemption wouldn't come easy. It wasn't just about saying sorry or being remorseful. It was about understanding the deeper issues that had led to her decision and working to unlearn the biases that had guided her for so long. Shaw was given the opportunity to reflect. She had to come to terms with the fact that her personal biases weren't just a minor flaw. They were a reflection of the system that had allowed those biases to fester. But the path to redemption wasn't as simple as acknowledgement. She had to confront the uncomfortable truths about herself and the way she had seen the world. She needed to ask herself, how had she let this happen? What had led her to point a gun at a fellow officer, a person she was supposed to protect and work alongside? It wasn't a question that could be answered easily, and the road to self-awareness would be long. For Williams, the story didn't end with her standing at the forefront of a national conversation. She had sparked a movement, but that movement was just beginning. Her struggle, though deeply personal, had become something larger, something that would force law enforcement and society as a whole to confront its problems. The truth was undeniable now. This incident wasn't just about a gun being pointed at an agent. It was about the system that had failed both Shaw and Williams. It was about a broken system that allowed a woman like Shaw to let her biases dictate her actions. It was about a culture that didn't demand accountability, that ignored the deep-rooted racial tensions within law enforcement. The truth that no one could escape was that Shaw's mistake wasn't isolated. It was a reflection of the much larger, much more dangerous problems within the system. As Williams continued to speak out, the calls for reform only grew louder. Officers who had been silent for years began to find their voice. For the first time, there was a real conversation happening within law enforcement about the need for change. But it wasn't just about changing policies or training. It was about changing hearts and minds. It was about acknowledging that systemic racism had become ingrained in the way law enforcement operated and taking action to address it. Williams didn't just want to see change. She wanted to see a world where no officer ever felt the need to point a gun at someone they were supposed to protect. She wanted to see a future where officers of all races were respected and treated with dignity, no matter their background. Shaw's actions had exposed something that couldn't be ignored anymore. And now, the ball was rolling. The conversation had started, and it wasn't going to stop. The movement was gaining momentum, but there was still so much work to be done. For Williams, this was just the beginning of a long fight for justice and reform. And for Shaw, it was a hard lesson in accountability and self-reflection, one that she would have to carry with her for the rest of her life. As this story ends, the larger message is clear. Systemic issues in law enforcement require both reform and self-reflection. The changes needed aren't just about altering policies. They're about changing the way we see and treat each other. The reality of racial bias, the unchecked power of authority, and the lack of accountability have created a broken system. But it's a system that can be fixed. It will take time, but it will happen. It has to happen. Williams and Shaw, in their own ways, represent two sides of the same coin. Williams stands as a beacon of hope, someone who has fought against injustice for so long, while Shaw is the embodiment of a system that has failed both her and Williams. But together, they've sparked something that no one can ignore anymore. And now, it's time for that system to change. Justice isn't just about punishment. It's about making sure that every person, regardless of their race or position, is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. The events we've seen unfold are just one example of the larger issues at play. It's easy to focus on the actions of a single person, but we must remember that this moment reflects something much deeper, a system that needs to change. For Agent Williams, it wasn't just about surviving that moment with Shaw. It was about holding up a mirror to an entire system, one that has long overlooked the issues of race and bias. We've seen how the smallest actions can lead to far-reaching consequences, and the only way forward is through accountability, reflection, and most importantly, change. So, what do you think? What do you believe is the most important change law enforcement needs to make to ensure a more just and fair system for everyone? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep the conversation going. Your voice matters, and together we can push for the change that's needed. If you found this story important and want to hear more about real stories of justice, accountability, and reform, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video. Let's keep talking about the change we need and continue working toward a better future. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.